Okay, so here's something that should mess with your head a little. We've flung probes past the edge of the solar system. We've parked rovers on Mars. We've walked around on the moon and hit golf balls up there for fun. But there's a place about 11 kilometers under your own 2 feet that we still, to this day, cannot truly explore. And it's not on some distant planet. It's right here. It's on the same rock you're standing on right now. If this kind of thing scratches your brain in the right way, do yourself a favor and subscribe. We post these every week. You can even smack the little bell if you're feeling fancy. That's it. That's the whole pitch. Back to the abyss. So let me explain why this is so weird. When you think about the hardest places for humans to reach, your brain goes straight up. Space, the moon, the far side of Mars. And yeah, those are absurdly far. But here's the crazy part. The moon is basically empty. It's a long, cold, lonely drive through nothing. Space doesn't push back on you. Space doesn't crush you. Space just lets you through. You build a rocket, you point it, you go. The barrier up there is distance. The trench is the opposite problem. The deepest part of the Mariana Trench, a spot we call the Challenger Deep, is only about 11 kilometers straight down. 11. You could walk that on a flat road in under 2 hours. You drive that distance to get to the grocery store and back without thinking about it. By the numbers, it is laughably close. It is, in raw distance, one of the nearest extreme environments to where you sit right now. And yet getting a human being down there and back is, in a lot of ways, harder than getting one to the moon. Because the sea doesn't just let you through. The sea is heavy. The sea is dense. The sea is relentless. Down there, it doesn't care about your engineering, your ambition, or your timeline. It just presses. Always. From every direction at once. And that's the real story here. This isn't a story about sea monsters or glowing creatures with too many teeth. This is a story about limits. About the one place on our own planet that quietly refuses to be conquered. Let me put the pressure into terms you can actually feel in your body, because the numbers alone don't land until you picture them. Right now, sitting where you are, you've got the entire atmosphere of Earth stacked on top of you. The whole sky, all that air, all the way up to space. And you don't feel a thing, because you grew up under it, and your body is built for exactly that load. One atmosphere of pressure. That's your normal. That's the air you've breathed your whole life. Now start thinking. Every 10 meters or so that you go underwater, you add another whole atmosphere's worth of pressure on top of what's already there. Just 10 meters. That's a swimming pool. Divers feel it in their ears the second they go under. That little squeeze, that pop. Now keep going. Past where any scuba diver could survive. Past where the water turns sunlight quits. Past where the water turns from blue to black, to a kind of dark that has never, not once, seen a single photon from the sun. Keep going down and down and down for 11 straight kilometers. When you finally reach the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the pressure pushing in on you is over 1,000 times what you feel standing on the beach. More than 1,000 atmospheres. And here's the comparison that actually makes people go quiet. That crushing force is like having around 50 jumbo jets stacked up and resting on your shoulders. 50 fully built airliners. On you. On every single square inch of you. From every direction. With no break, no pause, no mercy. That is enough force to bend steel. Enough to shatter glass like it's nothing. Enough to take a pocket of air and compress it down into basically nothing at all. Think about that for a second. Air. The stuff you can't even grab, the stuff that fills a balloon, gets squeezed down so hard at the bottom of the trench that it just collapses. The sea down there treats a steel beam the way you'd treat a soda can. It doesn't fight your machine. It folds it. This is why I keep saying the barrier isn't distance, it's force. You're not trying to travel far. You're trying to survive inside a place that wants to flatten anything you bring into it. Every single thing humans have ever sent into that trench, every camera, every steel sphere, every sub, has only made it back because we figured out how to argue with that pressure and win. Just barely, for just long enough. And when I say argue, I mean it almost literally. Every descent into the deep is a kind of negotiation. It's a conversation between what we built and what the sea is willing to allow. You don't beat the trench. You ask it, very politely, with several inches of titanium between you and it, if you can please come down for a little while. And sometimes it says yes. Now, to really get why this place humbles us, you've got to understand just how absurdly deep it actually is. Not in numbers, but in things you already know. Because 11 kilometers is one of those figures your brain skips right over. It sounds big, sure, but it doesn't hit. So let's put something familiar in there. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on the planet. The thing climbers train their entire lives to stand on top of. The place where the air is so thin, people literally die trying to reach the summit. Everest sticks up almost 9 kilometers into the sky. It's the high point of the entire world. Now picture this. Picture grabbing Everest, the whole mountain, base and all, and dropping it straight down into the Mariana Trench. Peak pointing up. You would lose it. The whole thing would vanish underwater. And not just barely. The very tip-top peak of Everest, the summit. The place people plant flags and cry and call their families from. That peak would still be sitting nearly 2 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. 2 more kilometers of black water on top of the highest point on Earth. The trench would swallow the tallest mountain in the world and still have room to spare. That's the kind of deep we're talking about. Not deep like a lake. Deep like the planet has a wound in it. And here's the thing that really gets me. We treat the ocean like it's just this flat blue blanket. You look out at the sea from a beach and it reads as featureless, calm, a smooth sheet stretching to the horizon. But that's only because the water's hiding everything. If you could somehow drain the ocean, pull the plug, let all that water run out, you would not be looking at a flat, muddy floor. You would be looking at the most dramatic landscape on the entire planet. Down there, under all that water, there are mountain ranges that go on for thousands of kilometers, longer than anything on dry land. There are canyons that would make the Grand Canyon look like a crack in the sidewalk. There are towering peaks, sheer cliffs, endless plains, and trenches that plunge down into total darkness. Everything you fight on land, every mountain, every valley, every cliff face, the ocean floor has its own version, often bigger, often more extreme. We've got the most spectacular terrain on Earth, and it's just sitting there, drowned, in total blackness, where almost no human eye has ever looked. And that's the part that should bother you a little. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we have of our own ocean floor. We can tell you the shape of craters on the Moon, the dunes on Mars, the storms on Jupiter. But the bottom of our own ocean, the thing that covers most of our own planet, is largely a blank. A guess. A best estimate. Because to map it properly, you have to fight that pressure the whole way down. And the trench, as we've established, does not make that easy. So how did we even find this place? Because that's a story all by itself, and it's wilder than you'd think. For most of human history, we had basically no idea how deep the ocean went. None. You'd stand on a ship in the middle of the open sea, surrounded by water in every direction, and you genuinely could not tell if the bottom was 100 meters down or 10 kilometers down. It was just blue, and then dark, and then unknown. The deep ocean was, for thousands of years, one of the biggest blank spaces on the map. Closer to us than the clouds, and somehow more mysterious than the stars. And the method we used to measure it for centuries, I need you to sit with how primitive this was. The only way to figure out how deep the water was to take a really long rope, tie a heavy weight to the end of it, and drop it over the side of the boat. That's it. That's the technology. You'd lower the weighted rope down, 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 and wait to feel it hit the bottom. Then you'd measure how much rope you'd let out, and that was your depth. They called it sounding the depths. It sounds simple. It sounds like it should work. But here's the problem. Out in the truly deep ocean, it barely worked at all. Because when your rope is kilometers long, the ocean currents grab it and drag it sideways. So it stops going straight down and starts drifting at an angle, throwing off your whole measurement. And worse than that, when you've got that much rope out, the weight of the rope itself is so heavy that you often couldn't even feel the moment it touched bottom. The little tug, the slack, it gets lost in all that mass. So you'd be standing on the deck, hauling in endless rope, and you genuinely could not tell whether your weight had hit the seabed or was still just hanging there in the dark. You were guessing. For centuries, our entire knowledge of how deep the ocean went was basically educated guessing with a rope and a rock. Which makes what happened next kind of incredible, because the discovery of the deepest point on the entire planet wasn't some triumphant, targeted mission. Nobody set out to find the bottom of the world. They more or less tripped over it. The year is 1872. Picture a wooden sailing ship, a converted British warship called the HMS Challenger, setting out from England on what was, at the time, an absolutely massive undertaking. This wasn't a quick trip. This expedition would spend nearly 4 years. 4 years circling the entire globe. Their whole job was science. Pure curiosity on a scale nobody had really attempted before. They sailed tens of thousands of nautical miles, crossing ocean after ocean. And the whole way they were stopping to study the sea, measuring temperatures, hauling up strange creatures from the deep, and again, dropping that weighted rope over the side to sound the depths. Think about the patience that takes. Day after day, in the middle of nowhere, you stop the ship, you lower a weighted line for hours, you record the number, you move on. Over and over. For years. The crew of the Challenger did this hundreds of times across the planet, slowly, painstakingly building the first real picture of what the bottom of the ocean actually looked like. They were basically inventing the science of the deep sea as they went. And then, out in the Western Pacific, near the Mariana Islands, they dropped their line and got a number that didn't make sense. The rope just kept going, and going. When they finally got a reading, it was deeper than anything they'd ever recorded, around 8,000 meters down, 8 kilometers. At the time, that was the deepest spot anyone had ever measured anywhere on Earth. They had, completely by accident, stumbled onto the deepest place on the planet. They weren't looking for it. They were just doing their patient, methodical, rope-over-the-side routine, and the ocean floor dropped out from under their weight. That spot, that impossibly deep notch in the bottom of the Pacific, got named after the ship that found it, the Challenger Deep. And it carries that name to this very day. Every time you hear someone talk about the Challenger Deep, the deepest known point on Earth, that's a direct callback to a wooden sailing ship full of curious scientists who spent 4 years circling the world with ropes and weights and happened to drop one in exactly the right spot. Now here's the thing. That first measurement of around 8,000 meters was already record-breaking, already deeper than anyone imagined. But it wasn't the real number. It was just the start. Because as the years went on, and as our tools got better, and we stopped relying purely on ropes and rocks, people kept going back to that same patch of the Pacific to measure it again. And every time, the number got bigger. The trench was even deeper than the Challenger crew had realized. The measurements pushed past 9,000 meters, then past 10,000. And eventually, the depth of the Challenger Deep was clocked at more than 10,900 meters, past 10.9 kilometers. That's the figure that finally settled in as a true scale of the place. And it's the number that lets Everest disappear underneath it with room to spare. From a guess with a rope to a hard figure of nearly 11 kilometers, the story of measuring the Challenger Deep is really the story of humans slowly, stubbornly refusing to stop asking, how deep is it? Until they finally got an answer. But, and this is the part that loops us right back to the beginning, measuring the depth is not the same thing as exploring it. Knowing a number is one thing. Actually going there is something else entirely. And that's where the trench reminds you who's in charge. Because think about what we just covered. It took the most ambitious scientific expedition of its era, 4 years at sea, to even find this place with a weighted rope. And finding it was the easy part. Going down into it, putting a human being, a fragile bag of water and air and bone, down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep and bringing them back alive, that's a whole different category of heart. That's where the 50 jumbo jets come back into the picture. That's where the steel-bending, glass-shattering, air-crushing pressure stops being a fun fact and becomes the actual wall standing between us and the deepest place on our planet. And this is why, even now, we say we can't truly explore the Mariana Trench. Not because we can't physically touch the bottom, a handful of people have, in machines built like armored bubbles. But touching it isn't exploring it. Walking up to the edge of something and tapping it once is not the same as knowing it. A true, complete, detailed map of the trench, the kind of map we have for entire regions of Mars, still does not exist. Most of that landscape down there, those canyons and ridges and pits, has never been seen by anyone. It's been measured, it's been estimated, but it has not been explored. It's still, in the most literal sense, the great unknown of our own world. And I want to come back to that idea of the conversation because it's the frame that really makes this whole thing click. Every single time a machine goes into that trench, it's not a conquest, it's a negotiation. You build the toughest sphere you can. You pack it with the strongest materials humans know how to make. You account for every gram of pressure you expect to face. And then you lower it into the dark and you find out whether the sea agrees with your math. If your design is good enough, it comes back. If you got it wrong, even slightly, even by a tiny margin, the trench corrects you, instantly and permanently, by folding your machine flat. That's what makes the deep so fundamentally different from space. In space, the enemy is emptiness, the vast, indifferent distance. You fail out there by running out of fuel or air, or by drifting too far. But in the trench, the enemy is presence. It's the overwhelming, physical, crushing presence of all that water, pushing in with a force we can barely hold back. Up is a problem of how far. Down is a problem of how hard. And it turns out how hard is the minor of the two problems. At least when the place you're trying to reach is right here, 11 kilometers under your feet, instead of 250,000 miles away. So think about where that leaves us. We are a species that has left footprints on the moon. We've sent our machines sailing right out of the solar system into interstellar space, carrying little messages in case anything out there ever finds them. We have looked billions of years back in time with our telescopes. We have done genuinely impossible sounding things by pointing ourselves up and out. And yet there is a trench in the floor of the Pacific Ocean, 11 kilometers down, that has humbled every one of those ambitions. A place so close you could walk the distance in an afternoon, and so hostile that reaching it remains one of the hardest things we've ever tried to do. That contrast is the whole point. The trench is a reminder that close and easy are not the same thing. That our own planet still holds a place we can barely visit, let alone understand. That for all our rockets and rovers and telescopes, there's a dark, heavy, relentless world right below us that we've mapped worse than another planet. The deepest part of Earth pushes back so hard that getting there beats getting to the moon, and a true map of it still doesn't exist. And when you really sit with that, the ocean stops being that flat blue blanket you see from the beach. It becomes what it actually is, a lid, a surface stretched over the largest, darkest, least explored space on the entire planet. Most of the living world is down there in that water, in that pressure, in that black, and we are only just barely able to peek in. Every dive, every camera lowered into the dark, every measurement scraped back from the bottom is a tiny win in a long, slow, careful conversation with a place that could crush us in an instant and barely notice. Let me take you back down there one more time, slowly, so it really sinks in. Because I think that the descent itself is the thing your brain needs to feel. Picture yourself sealed inside a tiny sphere, just big enough for one person, with walls thick enough that you feel claustrophobic just looking at them. The hatch closes. The light from above starts to fade as you sink past the first few meters. The blue gets deeper, then it gets dim. Within a few hundred meters, the last of the sunlight is gone completely, and you are in a darkness so total, it doesn't matter whether your eyes are open or shut. And you keep sinking. 1 kilometer, 2. The pressure outside your little sphere is already building into something violent. Something that would crush a normal submarine like a paper cup. And you're not even close to the bottom yet. 3 kilometers, 4. The temperature outside drops to just above freezing. There is no sound except the machine around you. 5 kilometers down, and the weight of the water above you is already beyond anything you can really comprehend. At the bottom is still more than twice as far below you as you've already come. 6 kilometers. 7. You are now deeper than Everest is tall, and there's still water below you. 8 kilometers. You've passed the depth that stunned the crew of the Challenger back in 1872, the number that was the deepest known place on Earth for a while. And you keep going. 9, 10. The walls of your sphere are doing a constant silent battle against 50 jumbo jets worth of force, and the only reason you're still alive is that someone's math was good enough. And finally, past 10.9 kilometers, you settle onto the floor of the Challenger Deep, the deepest point on the planet, a place that has been there in total black silence, under unimaginable pressure, since long before anything walked on land. And you look out, and there's almost nothing to see in your little circle of light. And beyond that circle stretches a landscape, real terrain, ridges and slopes and plains that no human eye has ever taken in. You're sitting on the least explored frontier on Earth, and it's not a distant planet, it's home. It's just the part of home that's hidden under the heaviest, darkest water in the world. That's why we can't truly explore the Mariana Trench. Not because we don't want to. Not because we don't have the curiosity, we clearly do. We proved that with a wooden ship and a weighted rope 150 years ago. We can't truly explore it because the deepest part of our own planet pushes back harder than almost anywhere we've ever tried to go. Because the barrier was never the 11 kilometers of distance. The barrier was the force packed into every one of those kilometers. And until we win that argument, until we build something that the sea is fully willing to allow all the way down, again and again, for long enough to actually map and study and understand what's down there, the trench stays exactly what it's always been, the closest unknown in the world. So next time you're standing on a beach, looking out at that calm, flat, friendly-looking water, remember what it's actually hiding. Remember that the smooth blue surface is a lead over mountain ranges and canyons and a trench deep enough to swallow Everest whole and ask for seconds. Remember that the hardest place for a human to reach isn't always the one that's farthest away. Sometimes it's the one pressing back the hardest, right under your feet. And remember that every time we've gone down there, we didn't conquer the deep. We just had a brief, careful conversation with it, between what we built and what the sea was willing to allow. And then we came back up, a little smarter and a lot more humble, into the light. Okay, so now we understand the wall, the pressure, the 50 jumbo jets, the steel-bending, glass-shattering force that turns the deepest place on Earth into a fortress. But here's the question that naturally comes next. If it's that brutal down there, how did anyone ever get to the bottom at all? Because somebody did. And the story of the first humans to reach the floor of the Challenger Deep is one of the most insane, white-knuckle gambles in the entire history of exploration. And almost nobody knows it. Let me take you back. The year is 1960. The whole world is locked into the space race. Everybody's looking up. Rockets, satellites, the moon. That's where the glory is. That's where the headlines are. That's where the money is going. And while everyone's staring at the sky, two men decide to go the exact opposite direction. They are going to point themselves down, into the one place on the planet that nobody has ever reached. And they are going to do it in a machine that, by today's standards, looks absolutely terrifying. Their names are Jacques Picard and Don Walsh. Picard is a Swiss engineer, the son of a guy who was obsessed with extremes. His father had actually built balloons to fly into the upper atmosphere, so going to dangerous edges of the world basically ran in the family. Don Walsh is a United States Navy lieutenant, a submariner, the kind of guy who spent his career inside steel tubes under the water. And together, these two are about to climb into a vessel called the Trieste and try to do something that everyone agreed was either heroic or completely suicidal. And honestly, probably both. Now you have to picture this machine, because it's not what your brain pictures when you hear submarine. The Trieste was what they called a bathyscaphe, and basically it worked like an underwater balloon, just flipped upside down in its logic. Up in the air, a balloon floats because it's filled with something lighter than air. Down in the water, the Trieste had a huge float chamber filled with gasoline, because gasoline is lighter than water and, crucially, it doesn't compress much under pressure. So the gasoline gave it buoyancy, and to sink, they loaded it up with tons of iron pellets as ballast. Want to go down? Hold the iron. Want to come back up? Dump the iron, and the gasoline floats you home. That was the whole concept. A gasoline blimp dragging a heavy iron anchor down into the abyss. And where did the two men actually sit? This is the part that gets me every time. They were crammed into a tiny steel sphere bolted to the bottom of the float. A cabin barely big enough for two grown men to stand in, shoulder to shoulder, basically unable to move. The walls of that sphere were thick steel, because that little ball was the only thing standing between Picard and Walsh and being instantly crushed into nothing. Everything else on the Trieste could flood, could fail, could get squashed, but that sphere had to hold. It was their entire world for the dive. A cramped metal bubble, barely lit, with two men breathing recycled air, sinking into the deepest hole on Earth. So picture this. It's the morning of the dive. They're out in the Western Pacific, near Guam, over the Challenger Deep. The exact patch of ocean the Challenger expedition stumbled onto almost 90 years earlier. The weather is rough. The sea is choppy and mean. Getting into the sphere is already a whole ordeal in those waves. And then the hatch is sealed. The iron ballast holds them down, and they begin to sink, slowly, into the blue, into the dark, into a place no human being has ever gone. And here's what that descent was actually like, because it was not quick and it was not comfortable. It took them around 5 hours just to reach the bottom. 5 hours of sinking through the black, watching the depth gauge tick down, listening to the hull, feeling the cold seep in. The temperature inside that sphere dropped to near freezing. They couldn't really move. They just sat there in the dark, descending into a pressure that was building with every meter, knowing that if anything went seriously wrong, there was no rescue. None. Nobody was coming to get them. You don't send a rescue team 11 kilometers down. If the sphere failed, it would be over before they even understood it had happened. Now let me tell you about the moment that should have ended the whole mission. The moment that proves just how thin the line was between triumph and disaster. They're deep, really deep. Somewhere down around 9 kilometers, getting close to the bottom. And suddenly there's a loud crack. A sharp, violent bang that echoes through the sphere and shakes the whole vessel. Imagine being where they were, kilometers of crushing black water above you, no rescue possible, and hearing the sound of something breaking. What had happened was that one of the outer window panes, a thick block of a special plastic in the entry tunnel, had cracked under the pressure. Not the main sphere itself, thankfully, but a part of the structure had genuinely fractured from the force. And these two men, sitting in their tiny steel ball at the edge of the deepest point on the planet, had to make a call. Do they abort? Do they dump the iron and run for the surface? Or do they keep going, trusting that the part that cracked wasn't the part that would kill them? They talked it over, they assessed it, and they decided to keep descending. They chose to keep going down, with the sound of breaking glass still ringing in their ears. That is a level of nerve I genuinely cannot wrap my head around. And they made it. After roughly 5 hours, the Trieste settled onto the floor of the Challenger Deep. 2 human beings, for the first time in history, were sitting at the absolute deepest point on planet Earth. Almost 11 kilometers of ocean stacked on top of them. The pressure outside their sphere was that full 50 jumbo jets on your shoulders force we talked about, pressing in from every side, and the only thing keeping them alive was that engineering had won the argument, just barely. And here's a detail from down there that I love, because it answered a question people had genuinely wondered about for a long time. When they got to the bottom, they looked out their little window, and they saw life. Picard reported seeing what he described as a flatfish, a creature that looked like a sole or a flounder, moving along the seabed. Now, scientists have argued ever since about exactly what he saw, whether it was really a fish or maybe a sea cucumber or some other organism. But the bigger point landed, and it landed hard. There was life down there. At the deepest, darkest, most crushing place on the entire planet, where the pressure should make complex life impossible, something was alive and moving around like it was no big deal. The deep wasn't dead. It was inhabited. That single observation changed how people thought about the limits of life itself. How long do you think they got to enjoy this historic moment? This place no human had ever been. About 20 minutes. That's it. They sat on the bottom of the world for roughly 20 minutes. And part of why they couldn't stay longer is almost funny in how anticlimactic it is. When the Trieste touched down, it kicked up a huge cloud of fine silt from the seafloor. That ultra-fine ooze billowed up around them like underwater dust, and basically blocked their view out the window. They'd traveled to the deepest point on Earth, and the floor itself kicked up so much mud that they could barely see it. So after about 20 minutes on the bottom, they dumped their iron ballast and began the long, slow float back up to the surface, the gasoline carrying them home through hours of darkness. Think about the scale of that achievement, and then think about what came after it. Because here's the part that's almost hard to believe. Those 2 men reached the bottom of the Challenger Deep in 1960. And after that, for decades, nobody went back. Not one person. The deepest point on our own planet got 2 human visitors for 20 minutes, and then sat there in the dark, untouched by people for more than 50 years. We went back to the moon multiple times. We built space stations. We sent missions all over the solar system. But the bottom of our own ocean? We touched it once, and then basically left it alone for half a century. That alone should tell you something about how hard this is. It's not that we forgot the trench was there. It's that getting down there is so brutally difficult, so expensive, so dangerous, that even with all our advancing technology, it took more than 50 years for anyone to even attempt the bottom of the Challenger Deep again. The moon, 250,000 miles away, got crowded with footprints faster than the trench 11 kilometers down got a second visitor. Let that sink in. That's the whole thesis of the story, written in dates. Now, speaking of going back, when someone finally did return, it was a name you absolutely would not expect. Because the next person to take a solo trip to the bottom of the Challenger Deep wasn't a Navy officer or a career oceanographer. It was a film director. The year is 2012, and the man climbing into the sub is James Cameron. Yeah, that James Cameron. The guy who directed Titanic and Avatar. And before you roll your eyes and think this was some celebrity stunt, let me explain. Because it's so much more serious than that. Cameron is genuinely, deeply obsessed with the deep ocean. This isn't a hobby he picked up for press. He's an actual explorer. He'd already done dozens of dives to the wreck of the real Titanic, more than 2.5 miles down, developing camera systems and submersible technology along the way. The man has spent a huge chunk of his life and his own money chasing the deep. And he set his sights on the one place almost no one had ever been, the Challenger Deep, and he decided he was going to go there alone. And the machine he went down in was the complete opposite of the Trieste, which is what makes the comparison so beautiful. Remember, the Trieste was this big, white gasoline blimp, a horizontal beast that drifted down slowly. Cameron's sub, called the Deep Sea Challenger, was a tall, narrow, vertical torpedo of a vehicle. It was designed to sink fast, nose down. Like a green vertical dart plunging straight into the abyss, he basically stood upright inside a tiny pilot sphere. His knees tucked up, packed into a ball even smaller and tighter than what Picard and Walsh had. One man, alone, in a vertical needle, dropping straight down into the deepest point on the planet. And this is decades later, with modern technology, and it was still absolutely a death-defying thing to do. The pressure hadn't gotten any weaker. The trench didn't care that it was the 21st century. Cameron sank for hours, alone, in total darkness, all the way down past 10.9 kilometers, until he reached the bottom of the Challenger Deep, becoming the first person to ever reach that depth solo, and only the third human being in history to reach the bottom at all, 52 years after the only other people to do it. And what he found down there is haunting in a different way than what Picard described. Cameron reported that the bottom of the Challenger Deep was this desolate, alien, lunar-looking landscape. A vast, flat, pale, empty plain, stretching out into the dark beyond his lights. He said it felt completely isolated, completely cut off from the rest of humanity. The most remote place he could possibly imagine. He spent hours down there this time, exploring, filming, gathering samples, doing real science. But the feeling he came back with was less about discovery and more about loneliness. That down there, at the bottom of the world, you are about as alone as a human being can possibly be. More alone, in some ways, than an astronaut. Because at least the astronaut can see the Earth. And here's a wrinkle that brings us right back to that idea of the sea allowing things, or not. Cameron's dive was a triumph, but it wasn't a free pass. His sub had problems. Some of the thrusters failed while he was down there. A hydraulic system started leaking. The vehicle was getting harder to control. And so, like Picard and Walsh before him, he had to make the call to cut his time short and head back up before he was really ready to leave. The trench let him visit. It did not let him stay. Even with all that modern engineering, all that money, all that obsession and preparation, the deep set the terms and the human obeyed. That's the negotiation, every single time. Now let's pull back, because all three of these dives, the Trieste in 1960, Cameron in 2012, they have something in common that I really want you to notice. Every one of them was a quick visit. A handful of people for a handful of minutes or hours, in a tiny protected bubble, looking out a tiny window at a tiny circle of seabed, and then back up. That's not exploration in the way we explore land. That's a touch, a tug. Proof that a human can survive there for a moment, but it leaves the trench almost completely unknown. Think about how we explored, say, a continent. We didn't send one person to stand in one spot for 20 minutes and call it explored. We sent people who walked across it, lived in it, mapped every river and ridge, came back season after season. We know our continents because we've spent generations crawling all over them. The Challenger Deep has had a grand total of a few human visitors in all of history, each of them stuck in a fixed spot, each of them able to see only the tiniest sliver of the bottom before the pressure and the failing equipment and the limited air forced them back to the surface. We have spent more human hours standing on the moon than we have spent standing on the deepest floor of our own ocean, by a lot. So when people say we've reached the bottom of the trench, that's true. But reaching is not exploring. And this is where the machines come in, because honestly, the future of the deep, and most of the actual exploring that's been done down there, doesn't belong to humans in spheres at all. It belongs to robots. And the reason why is the same reason it's all been so hard. The human body. We are the weak link. Think about everything we just talked about. To set a person down, you have to build a sphere strong enough to hold off 50 jumbo jets of pressure around a soft, fragile human who needs air to breathe, a stable temperature, food, and a way back up before they run out of any of those. The human is what makes it so heavy, so dangerous, so expensive, so limited to 20 minutes here and a couple of hours there. Take the human out of the equation, and suddenly the whole problem changes shape. A robot doesn't need to breathe. It doesn't care if it's cold. It doesn't panic when a window cracks. It doesn't need to come back up after 20 minutes because it's running low on air or its hands are going numb. You can build a machine that's basically just a tough little package of cameras, lights, sensors, and simple arms. And you can leave it down there for hours, for days, working the whole time, doing the patient, methodical mapping and sampling that actual exploration requires. The pressure is still the enemy. The machine still has to be built tough enough to survive, but you've removed the most demanding passenger of all, yourself. There are basically two flavors of these deep machines. There's the kind that stays connected to a ship on the surface by a long cable, a tether, that sends power down and beams video and data back up in real time. A pilot sits in a warm, dry control room on a ship far above and flies the robot around the seafloor with joysticks, watching through its cameras like it's a video game with the highest stakes imaginable. That tether is a lifeline and a leash at the same time. It keeps the robot powered and connected, but it also limits where it can go and tangles in rough terrain. And then there's the other kind, the truly independent machines that carry their own power and their own brain, that you drop into the water and they go off and do their job all on their own, with no cable, no pilot, following a program, mapping the floor in sweeping passes before coming back up on their own to be collected. These are the ones quietly doing the heavy lifting of actually charting the deep, drifting back and forth across the bottom of the ocean, pinging the floor, building up the maps we so badly lack. But even the robots, with all their advantages, run into the brutal limits of the deep. And there's one limit in particular that's wild, because it's a problem you'd never even think about until you're down there. Communication. Because here's the thing your phone has spoiled you on. Up here, on land and in the air, we send information with radio waves and light, instantly, everywhere. Wi-Fi, cell signal, satellites, invisible waves flying through the air at the speed of light. That's how you're watching this right now. But here's the catch. Those radio waves and that kind of signal do not travel through deep water. The ocean just eats them. Swallows them up almost immediately. So all the wireless tech that runs your entire life is basically useless the moment you go deep underwater. So how do you talk to a robot 11 kilometers down with no cable? You can't use radio. You can't use light over any real distance. The one thing that actually does travel through water is sound. So deep communication runs on acoustics, on pulses of sound, pings, sent through the water from the ship down to the machine and back. And it works, but it is slow, and it is limited. You can't stream crisp live video up through sound the way you'd stream it through a cable. You send simple commands, simple data, in slow acoustic pulses, and you wait. The deep ocean is, in a very real sense, one of the hardest places on Earth to simply send a message. We can talk to a rover on Mars more reliably than we can talk, in full detail, to a free-swimming robot at the bottom of the Challenger Deep. Mars, by the way, tens of millions of miles away. The trench, 11 kilometers down. And the trench is the harder conversation. There it is again. That contrast just never stops being insane. So picture the actual reality of exploring the deep trench today. You've got a ship on the surface, rolling on the waves. You've got, depending on the mission, either a tethered robot being flown by a pilot in a control room, or a free machine off doing its own programmed survey in the black. And the whole operation is this slow, painstaking, careful dance against pressure, darkness, cold, and the near impossibility of communication. Every hour of footage, every map, every sample of mud or water or strange creature scraped back from the bottom is hard-won. It is not easy. It is never easy. The trench makes you fight for every scrap of knowledge. And that's exactly why, after all this time, after the Trieste and Cameron and the robots and the decades of effort, we still have to admit the same thing we started with. We have barely scratched the surface of what's down there. Or barely scratched the bottom, I guess. Most of the trench has never been seen by human eyes or robot cameras at all. The maps we have are coarse and full of gaps. The life down there is barely catalogued. The geology, the chemistry, the sheer scale of that hidden landscape, it's mostly still a mystery. Every expedition brings back a little more, fills in a little more of the blank space. But the blank space is enormous, and the trench guards it jealously. Let me hit you with the comparison one more time, because it's the heartbeat of this whole thing. As of now, more people have gone to space than have been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. Way more. Hundreds of human beings have left the planet entirely and floated in orbit or stood on the moon. And the number who've reached the deepest point of our own ocean, you can count on a small handful of fingers across all of human history. The bottom of the trench is, statistically, one of the most exclusive places a human can go, not because we don't want to go, but because the planet itself is fighting to keep us out. And I keep coming back to why, and it's always the same answer, said 100 different ways. It's the pressure. It's the force. It's the 50 jumbo jets. It's the fact that water is heavy and relentless and doesn't compress and doesn't forgive. Space is empty and lets you pass. The trench is full and pushes back. Going up is a problem of distance, and we've gotten very, very good at distance. Going down is a problem of force, and force, it turns out, is a much harder boss to beat. Every dive, every robot, every map is one more round in a negotiation with a part of our own planet that has never once agreed to simply open up and let us in. So here's where I want to leave this chunk of the story. We've now met the people who actually went. Picard and Walsh in their gasoline blimp in 1960, riding through a cracking window into the dark. James Cameron, 52 years later, alone in his vertical Green Needle, staring out at the loneliest, most desolate plane a human has ever seen. We've met the robots that do the patient work now, the tethered ones flown like high-stakes video games, and the free ones charting the dark on their own. And we've run face first into the strange, frustrating limits, the 20-minute visits, the half-century gaps, the silt clouds, the failing thrusters. The fact that you can't even send a clear message through deep water. And through every single bit of it, the same truth keeps surfacing. Reaching the bottom is not the same as knowing it. A handful of humans have touched the deepest point on Earth, and we still don't have a true map of it. We've stood on the moon more than we've stood on our own ocean floor. The closest extreme place to where you're sitting right now is also one of the least explored places in the entire solar system. And the only reason for all of it, the whole stubborn, beautiful, humbling reason, is that the sea is heavy, the sea is dense, the sea is relentless, and every time we go down, we're not conquering anything. We're just having another careful conversation with the deep, between what we can build and what the ocean is willing to allow, and then coming back up into the light to figure out how to ask again. Okay, so now I want to turn the whole thing around on you, because so far we've been talking about the trench like it's a fortress that wants to kill anything we send into it. And it is. But here's the part that should break your brain a little. Something already lives down there. Not just survives, lives, thrives, builds entire ecosystems in a place we can barely visit for 20 minutes in an armored ball. And when you really look at how, it stops feeling like a dead zone and starts feeling like one of the most alive places on the entire planet, hiding in the one spot we assumed was empty. Let me back up, because for a long time people genuinely believed that the deep ocean was a desert. dead, lifeless. And the logic seemed airtight. Think about it. What do living things need? Most of the life you know about runs on sunlight. Plants soak up the sun and turn it into food. Then animals eat the plants. Then bigger animals eat those animals. And the whole chain, from the grass in your yard to the biggest whale in the sea, traces back to the sun. That's the foundation of basically everything alive that you can see. Sunlight in, life out. Now remember what we said about the deep. Sunlight quits within a few hundred meters. By the time you're a kilometer down, it's been pitch black for ages. And you've still got 10 more kilometers to go to reach the bottom of the Challenger Deep. So scientists looked at that and reasoned, well, no sunlight means no plants. And no plants means no food. And no food means no life. The deep trench, they figured, had to be a barren, frozen, crushing wasteland where nothing could possibly survive. It made perfect sense. It was also completely wrong, because life, it turns out, is far more stubborn and far more creative than anyone gave it credit for. And the first big crack in the everything needs sunlight idea came from one of the strangest discoveries in the history of science. Picture this. Researchers in submersibles exploring the deep sea floor come across these incredible structures, chimneys basically, jutting up out of the ocean floor, belching out thick clouds of black, superheated water. They look like underwater smokestacks pumping out smoke. So people called them exactly that. Black smokers. Hydrothermal vents. Here's what's happening at these vents. The seafloor in certain spots is geologically active. There's heat coming up from inside the earth. Seawater seeps down into cracks in the crust, gets blasted with heat and minerals from the planet's interior, and then comes roaring back out of these chimneys, superheated and absolutely packed with dissolved chemicals. We're talking water hot enough to melt some metals, gushing out into the near-freezing dark. It should be the most hostile spot imaginable. Boiling, toxic, lightless, crushing. And instead, it's an oasis, a riot of life. Around these vents, in the total blackness, kilometers down, scientists found thriving communities of creatures. Giant tube worms, longer than a person, with no mouth and no stomach, swaying in the chemical-rich water. Ghost white crabs, strange shrimp, clams the size of dinner plates. A whole bustling neighborhood of life clustered around these underwater chimneys in a place that, by all the old logic, should have been a graveyard. And the obvious question is, how? With no sunlight, what is feeding all of this? And here's the answer, and it genuinely rewrote biology. These ecosystems don't run on sunlight at all. They run on chemicals. At the base of this whole food web, instead of plants soaking up the sun, there are bacteria, microbes, that have figured out how to make food out of the chemicals pouring out of those vents. They take the toxic compounds in that superheated water, stuff that would poison you and me, and they turn it into energy and food. It's called chemosynthesis, making food from chemistry instead of from light. And those microbes become the foundation. The tube worms, the crabs, the clams, they all depend on those chemical-eating bacteria. The same way everything up here depends on sunlight-eating plants. Do you understand how huge that is? It means life doesn't actually need the sun. It found a completely separate, completely independent power source buried in the dark, running on the raw chemistry of the planet itself. There's a whole branch of life on Earth that has nothing to do with the sun, that could keep going even if the sun blinked out, feeding off the heat and chemicals leaking out of the world's interior. And it was hiding down there in the deep this entire time, in the exact place we'd written off as dead. Now the trench itself, the Challenger Deep, the deepest part, it's a slightly different beast than a hot vent, but the lesson carries down all the way to the bottom. Because even in the deepest, coldest, most crushing parts of the trench, where there's no convenient chemical chimney pumping out food, there is still life. And it gets fed in a way that's honestly kind of poetic and kind of gross at the same time. See, way up at the surface, in the sunlit water, life is everywhere. Plankton, fish, whales, the whole busy ocean we know. And all of that life eventually dies. When it does, the dead stuff, bits of plankton, scraps of dead animals, droppings, fragments of everything that lived and died up in the light, starts to sink, slowly, drifting down through the water column, kilometer after kilometer, like a constant, gentle, never-ending snowfall. Scientists actually call it marine snow. It's the soft, steady rain of organic crumbs falling from the bright world above into the dark world below. And that marine snow is the food delivery service for the deep. It drifts down and down and down, and a lot of it eventually settles all the way at the bottom of the trench. So the deepest, darkest place on the planet is, in a strange way, being constantly fed by leftovers raining down from the sunlit surface kilometers overhead. It's a thin, slow trickle of food. Nothing like the buffet up top, but it's enough. Enough to support an entire community of creatures that have adapted to live off the scraps of the world above. And the things that live down there to eat that snow, they are bizarre. They've had to become bizarre, because surviving at the bottom of the Challenger Deep means solving problems that no surface creature ever has to think about. Remember the pressure. 50 jumbo jets. Now imagine being a soft, squishy living thing in that. You can't have air pockets. They'd be crushed flat. You can't be built rigid and brittle. You'd shatter. So the creatures down there have evolved bodies that work with the pressure instead of fighting it. Soft, gelatinous, flexible bodies. Flesh that's adapted right down to the molecular level, so its proteins and cell walls don't collapse under a force that would instantly destroy anything from the surface. There are little shrimp-like creatures called amphipods scuttling around down there, scavenging the marine snow and anything dead that falls. And here's a wild detail. In the deep trenches, some of these amphipods grow way bigger than their shallow water cousins. Giant versions. Where you'd expect deep-sea things to be small and starved, some of these scavengers balloon up into supersized forms, a phenomenon that still has scientists scratching their heads. And then there's the snailfish, the fish that holds the record for living deeper than almost anything else with a backbone. It's this pale, soft, almost translucent little creature, looking delicate and floppy, like it would fall apart if you touched it. And yet that fragile-looking fish is one of the toughest animals on the planet, perfectly engineered to live and hunt at depths that would crush a steel submarine. It's not delicate at all. It's a master of the most extreme environment on Earth. Think about what that means. We spent millions of dollars and decades of engineering to build a sphere strong enough to drop a single human into that place for 20 minutes. And meanwhile, a little soft fish is just down there, living its whole life. Hunting, swimming, breeding, with no sphere, no titanium, no air supply, no rope to the surface. Its body is a technology. Evolution solved, over millions of years, the exact problem that we can barely solve at all with all our engineering. The pressure that bends our steel is just Tuesday for the snailfish. There's something deeply humbling in that. The trench that defeats our best machines is somebody's home. And here's where it gets darker, and honestly kind of heartbreaking. Because we've established that almost no human has ever been to the bottom of the trench. We've established that it's the most remote, isolated, untouched place we know of. So you'd think, you'd really hope, that if there's one corner of the planet we haven't ruined, one place still pristine and pure and free of our mess, it would be down there. The deepest, hardest to reach spot on Earth. Surely that's still clean. It's not. And this is the part that genuinely stopped me cold when I first learned it. When scientists finally got cameras and sampling equipment down to the very bottom of the deepest trenches, into that snailfish and amphipod world that almost no human has ever seen, they found our garbage. They found plastic, a plastic bag, candy wrappers, bits of human trash sitting at the deepest point on the entire planet, in a place we can barely even reach. Let that sink in for a second. We can't get ourselves down there. It's one of the hardest journeys in all of human exploration. But our plastic got there just fine. It sank, drifted down through 11 kilometers of black water with the marine snow, and came to rest on the floor of the deepest place on Earth, waiting for us when we finally showed up to look. There is no longer a single part of this planet that is untouched by us. Not the top of Everest, not the poles, and not even the bottom of the Challenger Deep. We reached the deepest point with our trash before we'd even properly explored it ourselves. And it gets even more invisible and even more unsettling, because it's not just the bugs and wrappers you can see. When researchers studied those deep-sea amphipods, the little scavengers, the supersized ones, the ones living at the very bottom of the deepest trenches, they tested their bodies, and they found man-made pollutants inside them, toxic chemicals, industrial stuff that we made and used and dumped decades ago, found inside the tissue of creatures living in the most remote place on the planet. The pollution isn't just sitting on the seafloor next to them, it's inside them. It worked its way down through the marine snow, into the food chain, into the bodies of animals in a place no human had ever set foot, and built up there in the very flesh of the deep. So the trench isn't this pristine, sealed-off wilderness after all. It's connected to us, tied to the surface by that constant rain of marine snow, and now by the rain of our garbage and our chemicals along with it. The deepest, most isolated spot on Earth turns out to be downstream from everything we do up here. Whatever we put into the ocean eventually finds its way down. There is no away. There's just down. And down is the trench. Now I want to pull this back up to the bigger picture, because there's a reason all of this matters beyond just being mind-blowing trivia. The deep ocean, the trench included, isn't some separate, disconnected world that we can ignore because it's hard to reach. It's a massive, active part of the machinery that keeps our whole planet running. And we are only just starting to understand how. Think about the sheer scale of it. The ocean covers most of the surface of the planet, and the average depth of it is way deeper than people realize, kilometers down on average. So the deep, dark, high-pressure part of the ocean isn't some rare little corner. It's the majority of the living space on Earth. By volume, by actual three-dimensional room for life to exist in, the deep sea is the single biggest habitat on the entire planet. Most of the places where life can live on this world are down there in the cold and the dark and the pressure. The sunlit world you know, the surface, the land, the shallow seas, that's the thin little skin on top. The real bulk of the planet's living space is the deep. And that enormous deep ocean does things for us that we absolutely depend on, whether we notice or not. The ocean soaks up a huge amount of the heat that gets trapped on our planet, and a huge amount of the carbon dioxide we pump into the air. The deep sea, with its slow, cold, massive currents, is like a giant storage system, pulling heat and carbon down out of the atmosphere and locking it away in the depths for a long, long time. That marine snow we talked about, all that dead organic stuff raining down and getting buried at the bottom, that's part of how carbon gets pulled out of the cycle and stashed in the deep. The trench and the deep ocean are quietly helping regulate the climate of the entire planet, doing it in the dark where nobody's watching. And here's the scary flip side of that. Because we understand the deep so poorly, because we can barely get down there, because we have no good maps, because we've only studied tiny scraps of it, we genuinely do not fully know how it all works, or how fragile it is, or what happens if we mess it up. We're leaning on this gigantic system to absorb our heat and our carbon and our pollution, and we're doing it half-blind, with almost no understanding of the deepest, biggest part of it. We're running a planet-scale experiment on a system we can't even properly see. That should make you a little nervous. It makes the scientists who study it very nervous. This is the part that flips the whole story for me. We started off talking about the trench like it's just this extreme, exotic place. A fun fact, the deepest hole, the spot where Everest disappears. But the deep ocean isn't a curiosity off in some corner. It's the biggest part of our world. It's where most of the living space is. It's a key piece of how the climate stays stable. It's full of life forms running on power sources we didn't even know existed a few decades ago. And it's so poorly explored that we are basically flying blind over the most important and least understood part of our own planet. And every bit of that comes back to the same wall we keep slamming into. The pressure, the force, the fact that the sea is heavy and dense and relentless and it doesn't want to let us in. The only reason we know so little about the biggest, most important habitat on Earth, the only reason we've catalogued so few of its creatures, mapped so little of its flora, understood so little of how it shapes our climate, is that it is just so brutally, stubbornly hard to get down there and stay long enough to learn anything. The trench guards its secrets with the most effective security system in the universe. Pure, crushing physics. So let me leave you sitting with the contrast one more time, because it's even sharper now. Down at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, in a place we can barely visit, where our best machines get folded flat, there's a soft little snailfish swimming around like it's nothing. There are giant scavengers feeding on snow that fell from a sunlit world they'll never see. There are microbes building entire kingdoms out of raw chemistry, proving life never needed the sun at all. There's a whole living world down there, ancient and strange and thriving. And tragically, there's our plastic bag sitting in the middle of it, and our chemicals soaked into the bodies of its animals. It's the biggest habitat on the planet. It's helping run our climate. It's teeming with life that rewrites what we thought life even was. And it's already touched by our pollution before we've even managed to explore it. The deepest place on Earth is somehow both the most alien and the most connected place there is. And we still can't truly explore it, not because there's nothing there, but because there's a whole world there. And the door to it is guarded by 50 jumbo jets worth of force that does not, ever, take a day off. Every time we manage to crack that door open even a little, to drop a camera, to catch a snailfish on film, to scoop up a sample of mud, we learn that the dark, heavy, relentless deep is far richer, far stranger, and far more important than we ever imagined. And that there's so much more of it we still haven't seen. Okay, so by now you get the picture. The trench is a fortress. It's alive, it's huge, it's running part of the planet, and we can barely get into it. But here's the question we haven't really answered yet. If it's this hard, this dangerous, this expensive, this stubborn, why do we even bother? Why keep throwing money and machines and the occasional brave human being into a hole that folds still for fun? Because the honest answer to that is where this whole story finally pays off. Let me explain, because the reasons are way better than just because it's there. Start with the most practical one, the stuff that could literally save lives up here on the surface. Remember those creatures we talked about, the ones living at the bottom of the Challenger Deep? The snailfish, the giant amphipods, and especially those microbes feeding off raw chemistry at the hot vents? Every one of those organisms is a survival problem solved. They've figured out how to keep their bodies working under pressure that destroys our machines. They've figured out how to function in near-freezing cold, in total darkness, eating poison with almost no food. Their bodies are packed with chemical tricks, special proteins, special enzymes, special compounds that no surface creature has, because no surface creature ever needed them. And here's why that matters to you, sitting up here in the warm, dry world. Some of those deep-sea chemical tricks turn out to be incredibly useful to us. Enzymes from deep-sea microbes that can work under extreme conditions get used in industry, in medicine, in research. Compounds pulled from deep ocean creatures are being studied as the basis for new drugs, potential treatments for cancer, for infections, for diseases we're still fighting. There is a real, serious possibility that the cure for something that kills people right now is sitting inside the body of some strange organism at the bottom of a trench, just waiting for us to find it and understand it. The deep ocean might be the biggest untapped medicine cabinet on the planet. And we've barely opened the door. Think about how that reframes the whole thing. That alien world down there, that place that seems so useless and hostile and far away, it might be holding answers to problems we're desperate to solve up here. Every creature we can study, every microbe we can sample, is a potential breakthrough. And we've only met a tiny fraction of what lives down there. The rest is still in the dark, uncatalogued, unstudied, full of who knows what. That's not a wasteland. That's a treasure chest we can't quite reach. Then there's the second reason, and it points the opposite direction. Not down into our own planet, but out into space. Because here's something that sounds crazy until you really think about it. Studying the bottom of the Challenger Deep might be one of the best ways we have to figure out where alien life could exist. Let me explain, because the logic is beautiful. For a long time, when we searched for life beyond Earth, we looked for places like home. We looked for warmth, for sunlight, for liquid water sitting out in the open under a friendly sun. That was the recipe, Earth-like conditions, because Earth was the only example of life we had. But then we found those creatures at the deep sea vents. Life with no sunlight. Life running entirely on chemistry and heat from inside the planet. And that single discovery blew the search for alien life wide open. Because suddenly, a world didn't need to look like Earth to maybe have life. It just needed heat, water and chemistry. It didn't need a sun at all. Now look out at the solar system with those new eyes. There are moons out there. Moons orbiting the giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, that are covered in thick shells of ice. Frozen, dead-looking little worlds, way too far from the sun to be warm on the surface. For a long time, nobody thought twice about them. But here's the thing we now know. Underneath those icy shells, some of those moons are hiding vast oceans of liquid water. Whole hidden seas, bigger than the oceans of Earth, sloshing around in the dark under kilometers of ice. And down at the bottom of those alien oceans, there may well be hydrothermal vents, the exact same kind of hot, chemical-rich underwater chimneys that feed life at the bottom of our own ocean. Do you see where this is going? If life on Earth can thrive at deep sea vents with no sunlight, running purely on heat and chemistry from the planet's guts, then life on one of those alien moons could be doing the exact same thing, right now, at the bottom of a hidden ocean, in the cold and the dark, far from any sun. And the single best place we have to study how that kind of life works, to understand what it would look like and how to look for it, is the deep ocean right here on Earth. The bottom of the Challenger Deep is, in a very real way, our practice run for finding life on other worlds. Our trench is a laboratory for the entire universe. That's why scientists who care about alien life care so much about the deep sea. The vents, the snailfish, the chemical-eating microbes. They're not just curiosities. They're proof of concept. They're the living evidence that life can take hold in the most extreme, lightless, high-pressure places imaginable. And if it happened down there, in the crushing dark of our own planet, then maybe it happened out there too, under the ice of a distant moon. The deepest part of Earth and the search for life across the cosmos turn out to be the same story. To look for aliens, you first have to understand the strangest life on your own planet, and that life is hiding at the bottom of the sea. And then there's the third reason, and honestly it's the one I find the most human, the most simple, and the most powerful. We bother because we don't like not knowing. Because there is a blank space on the map of our own planet, the deepest, biggest, least understood place we have, and something deep in us cannot stand to leave it blank. The same itch that pushed the crew of the Challenger to spend 4 years circling the globe dropping a rope over the side. The same drive that put 2 men in a cracking gasoline blimp in 1960. The same obsession that sent a film director alone into a vertical green needle to stare at the loneliest plane on Earth. We go because it's there, and because not knowing what's down there is, for our species, basically unbearable. And here's the thing that ties the whole story together. After everything, after the Challenger expedition, after Picard and Walsh, after 50 years of silence, after Cameron, after all the robots and all the maps and all the samples, we still have only the faintest sketch of the deepest part of our planet. A true, complete, detailed map of the Mariana Trench still does not exist. Most of that hidden landscape down there has never been seen by anyone or anything. We know the deepest point is nearly 11 kilometers down. We know Everest would vanish inside it. We know there's life down there, weird and tough and beautiful, and we know our garbage beat us to the bottom. But the full picture, the real detailed knowing, we don't have it, not even close. And that's not a failure, that's the point. That's the whole humbling, magnificent point of this story. We are a species that has walked on the moon, sent machines beyond the solar system, looked back nearly to the beginning of time with our telescopes. And there is a place 11 kilometers beneath our own feet that has out-resisted all of it. Not because it's far, it's absurdly close. But because it pushes back so hard, with so much weight and pressure and relentless force, that reaching it and truly knowing it remains harder than reaching the moon. The barrier was never distance. The barrier was always force. And force, it turns out, is the one thing we still can't simply out-engineer our way around. So let's bring it all the way back to where we started, to you, sitting wherever you're sitting right now. Underneath you, somewhere, eventually, is rock. And under that, more rock. And the whole churning interior of the planet. And out across the world, under most of the surface of Earth, there's water, kilometers of it, getting colder and darker and heavier the deeper it goes, until it reaches places like the Challenger Deep, where the pressure is 50 jumbo jets on your shoulders and the dark has never once seen the sun. That's not a faraway alien world. That's home. That's the same planet you live on. It's just the part of home we've never been allowed to truly visit. And I think there's something kind of perfect about that. We spend so much time looking up, at the moon, at Mars, at the stars, dreaming about the frontiers out there. And the whole time, the greatest unexplored frontier we have is straight down, closer than the clouds, closer than the nearest city, in raw distance, right beneath the calm blue surface that looks so flat and friendly from the beach. The biggest habitat on the planet, the engine room of our climate, a kingdom of life running on rules we barely understand, a possible answer to whether we're alone in the universe. All of it, down there in the dark, waiting. Every time we go down, we don't conquer it. We've said that the whole way through, and it's the truest thing in this entire story. We don't beat the trench. We have a conversation with it. We build the strongest thing we can. We lower it into the black, and we find out whether the sea agrees with our math. If our design is good enough, it comes back. And it comes back carrying a tiny scrap of knowledge. One map, one creature, one sample, one more piece of the puzzle. And if we got it wrong, the trench corrects us instantly and permanently, and reminds us exactly who's in charge down there. Every descent is a negotiation between what we built and what the sea is willing to allow. And slowly, scrap by hard one scrap, across centuries, we're learning to ask better questions. We will go back. We always do. Better robots, better materials, better maps. Bit by bit, the blank space will shrink. Someday, maybe, there will be a real complete map of the Challenger Deep. And our great-grandkids will look at the deep ocean the way we look at a familiar coastline. But it will take time, and patience, and a deep respect for the force that lives down there. Because the deepest part of our own planet doesn't care about our ambition or our timeline. It just presses. Always. From every direction. And the only way through is to keep building, keep asking, keep lowering ourselves into the dark with humility, and keep coming back up a little smarter than we went down. That's the Mariana Trench, the closest unknown in the world, a place we measured with a rope before we could reach it, touched for 20 minutes and then ignored for half a century. And still, after all this time, cannot truly explore. Because the barrier was never how far, it was always how hard. And how hard, 11 kilometers down in the heavy, dense, relentless dark, turns out to be the toughest frontier we've got. So next time you stand at the edge of the ocean and look out at all that quiet blue, just remember what's underneath it, and remember that the hardest place in the world to reach has been right beneath your feet this whole time. Thanks for coming all the way down to the bottom with me. Now go look at the sea a little differently.